Has that worked?
Yep, we see that.
Yes.
Good afternoon, gentlemen.
I recognise that voice.
Hey, is that John Gavin? Hi.
It is, Alex. How are you? You all well?
Yeah, very good, thanks.
Yeah, we're well. How are you?
Yeah, no, I'm good. I'm good. It's Microsoft software let me down a bit this morning. The whole bloody Windows 10 crashed. But there we go. That's what happens.
Nothing we can do about that, I'm afraid.
No, I know. Don't worry.
Have you thought about the cloud, John?
Well, yeah. No, I've got several versions of 365. I've got it on the machine. I was thinking of getting a Unix machine as well.
Well, welcome. See, we've got a few attendees joining. This is good.
Yeah, we got people coming in.
Kick off.
We'll
kick off formally in a couple of minutes' time.
I'm just going to leave for a second and rejoin in 2 seconds.
Sure thing, Marcus.
Thanks.
All right, how's everybody doing?
We're all good, Ronnie. How's you?
Not too bad, thank you.
Good stuff.
Just
You making it
doing away.
You working exclusively from home, or are you making it into the office these days?
Exclusively from home, and the way it's looking work-wise, it's probably going to be that way until the end of this year.
Yeah, I think a lot of us are in that boat.
Because we've like a 3-phase plan, but we don't enter phase 1 until then Scotland's in phase 3.
Sure.
And because obviously after public transport in, it's we're one of the last lot of people making it in.
Yep. Playing the waiting game.
Indeed.
Playing the waiting game.
What about yourselves? Are you just working from home all the time as well, or?
Yeah, that's our life at the moment. We're all getting the cabin fever and finding newfound appreciation for little slivers of land in our gardens and stuff to which we can escape while staying socially distant. Yeah, it's gone on for a long time, and without any immediate end in sight, it'll be a challenge.
Yeah, I've got 2 big blueberry bushes. I've got rows of radishes, rows of lettuce, rows of spring onions, rows of leeks. I've got a garden full of onions and tatties. And yeah, I've been busy in the garden.
So we'll all come to yours when it all goes down. We'll come to yours and you'll feed us. Good.
Yeah. The neighbours the other side of the fence as well. They've got 3 chickens as well. So I'm thinking of bargaining with them to exchange eggs for tatties.
It worked in the past. Yes. Grand. Okay, it's 2 minutes past, so I think we'll just make a start. Welcome to the resumption of our Cloud Pathway events. These are the things that we would really love to be doing face to face, but in these troubled times, we've resorted to virtual technology. So a huge thank you for showing up and enduring the pains of yet another conferencing platform and joining us to hear about how IT companies run their Microsoft workloads in AWS. So yeah, huge thank you for coming along. We've got a great lineup. Got some very talented speakers and discussion panel members this evening. I'm your host, I'm Alistair. I'm one of the principal engineers at Cloudsoft. We are an AWS advanced consulting partner, and we help companies large and small migrate workloads from various legacy environments into AWS. Many of those, an increasing number of those, are featuring Microsoft. As we expect, Microsoft is entrenched in the on-prem world. There's lots of legacy running Microsoft, which gets its tentacles into everything. So yes, some interesting technical challenges that we've had with some of our customers, a couple of whom are represented here this evening, and we'll have some interesting chat with them. We also have Alad. Give us a wave, Alad. Alad's over there. He's Cloudsoft's VP of Engineering. Michael Hart does he have his camera on? Oh, there's Michael. Hi, Michael. He works for AWS. He is a Microsoft specialist with AWS. He's going to be talking a little bit about the Microsoft support story, the history of support for Microsoft stacks over the years with AWS managed services. We've got Dan Pacitti, who down in Croydon, who is the CTO at a lovely company called ASP Events, one of our customers who we've been consulting with for some time. They've had a very interesting cloud migration and application modernization journey that Dan will be having a chat about. And is Marcus back? Marcus Corner is an experienced technical consultant contractor who has lent his big brain to many IT consultancy projects, including one around digital transformation with Insights Learning and Development up in Dundee, and he's here to spend a little bit of time talking about some of those war stories, the tales from the trenches. So we've got a great lineup tonight, and before we get going, normally I would thank you for coming out and braving the elements, but of course in these strange times I hope we're all comfortable. Hope we've been working from home comfortably, and I hope we're all sitting around in some comfortable loungewear with a tasty beverage. I hope you make yourselves comfortable. There will be a chance to ask questions. The latter part of this event will be very much our interactive session. We'll have some questions for the four panel members there. So if you do have questions, I would ask that you use the chat function in Chime. There's a little chat box where you can either just indicate that you're raising your hand, indicate that you have a question to ask, or if you're comfortable and quick at typing, feel free just to type your question in there and I'll present it to the panel members when the time comes. We'll have a couple of presentations before the open session. If you do have questions at the end of each of those, there'll be a brief pause where we can put some questions to the presenters, but feel free to save them up for the fireside chat if you feel free. So normally I would point out where the fire exits are, but I'm sure you know how to exit your own houses. But I will point you instead to the mute button in Amazon Chime. This is the first time we've run a virtual event of this size, and if everyone talks at once, it gets unbearable. So I think people are generally allowed to unmute themselves. I would ask that you don't do that on an ad hoc basis. Like I say, if you have a question to ask, please raise your hand in the chat window or submit your questions there. If you're happy to ask those questions live on air, I'm quite happy to hand over to you, but please, when you're not talking, use the mute button, Luke. This session is being recorded. I hope everyone's okay with that. The first order of business, we have a small agenda. I've made the introductions. Michael Hart is going to be, as I've mentioned, talking about the Microsoft programs that are available through AWS. My colleague Alad will be giving a presentation around some high-level strategies around cloud adoption and migration. And then we'll open up to some really interesting war stories with some Q&A at the end. So without any further ado, with one small part of further ado, I would like to say that on the back of this event, Cloudsoft, we're going to be running some short consultancy surgeries around AWS adoption. If there is any interest among the attendees here, we're more than happy to sign you up for a free half-hour session to discuss AWS and cloud adoption more generally, how to choose which cloud is the right one for you, and how to undertake the migrations and do all the organizational and technical planning that ensures that that goes smoothly. So if that is something that you're interested in, then feel free to, I'll put this email address up, I'll put this web address up at the end as well, but feel free to drop us a line. That is the extent of the sales pitch. Without any further ado, I'd love to hand over to Michael Hart from AWS. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Alistair. Hope everyone can hear me okay. I will just look to share my screen here. Hopefully everyone can see that.
Yeah, we see that.
Fantastic. Great stuff. So first of all, some quick introductions. My name is Michael Hart, and I work here at AWS as a Microsoft specialist working within our business development team. A quick thank you to the team at Cloudsoft for inviting me here today. They asked me to just provide a quick overview of Microsoft technologies on AWS, sort of the history, where our technology has been developed, where it's come from and where it is today, and some common sort of use cases for Microsoft on AWS, and also focusing on some core technology areas. It's not an exhaustive presentation by any means. We're looking at about 15 minutes here, and then we'll move on to the next section. But yeah, certainly an opportunity at a high level to get an understanding of Microsoft and AWS. And obviously, if you have any further questions, as Alistair said, I'm happy to field those later today. Okay, so firstly, we have a huge amount of customers utilizing Microsoft and AWS. We have over 2.5 times the number of customers globally than our sort of nearest provider that's out there. Here is sort of selection of a number of global recognizable brands. There's a lot of information on our website in terms of the use cases that we have around Microsoft and AWS technologies and these particular customers, whether they're, organizations such as McDonald's, Experian, Unilever, the NHS in the UK, for example. And this is sort of testament really to the sort of breadth and depth of capabilities that AWS has globally for these customers. It's important to note before we sort of get into Microsoft on AWS and some of the technology subset, the global infrastructure that AWS provides for customers, and the reason, and this is one of the core reasons why customers are moving workloads over to AWS. We're kind of unrivaled really in terms of our global distribution of this infrastructure, and the way that we the way that we deploy, the way that our infrastructure is put together. We have a specific terminology. We have a number of regions. We have 24 today across the world, and within those regions we have what's called availability zones. And this is some of the most core sort of areas to really focus on when it comes to developing and working with AWS and deploying workloads onto our infrastructure. We've recently announced some new regions coming up, such as Spain, Japan and Indonesia, and this year seems to have been a bumper year for regions across the globe for AWS to launch, and we've seen regions popping up in Italy, in Milan, and in Cape Town in Africa as well. So it's sort of testament to the investment that Amazon and AWS are making for across the infrastructure, and it really enables customers to deploy workloads anywhere in the world. So again, just diving a little deeper into the overarching global infrastructure and why customers are migrating workloads over to AWS and Microsoft Workloads. We sort of the terminology focuses on regions and availability zones. So a region is a physical location whereby it could be anywhere in the world, and within those regions we have multiple availability zones. And those availability zones actually consist, each one consists of one or more discrete data centers which have redundant power, networking, connectivity, and housed in separate facilities. So this is really important in terms of how you look to deploy workloads globally, and can really help you in terms of building out highly resilient and fault-tolerant applications. Not only this, but you can also leverage sort of our Amazon CloudFront, which is our CDN environment. So wherever your customers are in the world, you can deploy your workloads and get as close as possible for low latency purposes or for distribution of content globally. And not only with regards to our overarching infrastructure, is some of the reasons why customers move to AWS. It's also around some of the innovation around Microsoft and AWS technologies. So whether it's back in 2008, when we initially launched services around Windows Server, SQL Server, all the way up to very recently around SQL Server 2019. We've been exponentially innovating on behalf of customers with, we're now supporting over 200 instant types, 37 instant families, and 60 plus different AMIs for Windows workloads. And going back to sort of the release this year around SQL Server 2019 on EC2, that was released within a week, which of it being released by Microsoft, which allowed our customers to do a quick lift and shift to AWS, but also to modernize that workload as well. So whether you're running that potentially on Linux and taking advantage of all the latest and greatest features. Not just simply Windows Server and EC2, .NET development is a core part of Microsoft services on AWS. So whether you are looking at .NET Core, whether you're running .NET, with Visual Studio, etc., we have an extensive platform that can help support your development and modernization as well. So if you're looking to modernize to container-based workloads or serverless workloads, AWS can support you from a .NET and Microsoft point of view. It's also worth mentioning, so we've talked a little bit about infrastructure, our global reach. We talked a little bit about the breadth and depth of services. It's also worth mentioning around the agility that you have with AWS around how you deploy your licenses or Microsoft licenses on AWS. With AWS, you get a couple of options, mainly focusing in on you can acquire licenses from us, take away the pain of managing the level of compliance with those Microsoft licenses with things like SQL Server or Windows Server, or you can bring your licenses across in a BYOL model, and that can be across our shared tenancy environment if you have license mobility or software assurance, or it can be through dedicated options when there's no eligibility there for licenses to be ported across. So it's a real key component that AWS can provide you with that agility around licensing. So if we bring all of this together, I just wanted to quickly show a use case of why our infrastructure, the breadth and depth of services, and the license agility enable you to save on costs and lower your TCO when you're coming to deploy. So this is just quite a simple and example of this, whereby today you may be running SQL Server on premise in a single DC, within a single region, and applying local synchronous replication between a master and a replica. and then you may have a secondary instance in a separate data center, which may be hundreds or even thousands of miles away, with asynchronous replication. So this is, we get feedback from customers that they want to sort of modernize this approach. It can be expensive and complex. There is obviously the need for 3 nodes here, which has some considerations around licensing and cost. And there is potential for downtime and loss of data in terms of this type of SQL Server deployment. So when you migrate to AWS, we can leverage the infrastructure, which I've talked about at the beginning of the presentation. We can obviously leverage some of the breadth and depth of functionality, and also the licensing options that you have. So this is how a typical SQL Server deployment may look in AWS. You can leverage those availability zones to reduce your SQL Server footprint. So we're now down to 2 instances, not 3. You can have that synchronous replications between availability zones, between master and replica, and obviously that will assist and support a deployment that is sort of 0 downtime and 0 loss of data. So this is a deployment that we have in a number of different sort of best practice documentation, something that customers can use, and there's plenty of quick start information around this via our website and via the console, and customers are using it day in, day out, such as Sony there, which is given us an example. So we've talked a little bit about the typical deployment around SQL Server, but how do customers typically migrate? And what are the sort of core elements of this migration? We've been working with customers since 2008, and this is a mature methodology, and we work very closely with partners such as Cloudsoft in this type of methodology. And I know Aled is going to talk a little bit more about this, but generally speaking, we work with customers from an assessment point of view, understanding the current footprint of your infrastructure, moving to mobilize and migrate that infrastructure with the overarching goal of optimizing and modernizing that environment, whether it's looking at serverless technologies, container-based technologies, or open source technologies. And optimization is incredibly important, ensuring you have the lowest possible TCO, you right-sizing for the cloud, and ensuring that those workloads are as cost-effective as possible. So just diving a little bit deeper into that, migration strategies, and I know again the team at Cloudsoft can support you with this around assessing your current environment around the Gartner 7Rs. However, this is some of the use cases we see a lot of, whether it's rehosting SQL Server on EC2 or Windows Server, replatforming SQL Server on RDS. So RDS is our managed service, which helps customers remove some of the what we call the undifferentiated heavy lifting or the operational overhead of running SQL Server. And you can also look to refactor and reduce that operational cost even further with open source technologies and cloud native technologies such as DynamoDB, Amazon Aurora, Redshift for your data and analytics, and much more. So, Amazon Aurora is a popular choice for the modernization area of SQL Server. Can help you reduce your costs to around 1/10 of what you may be running today with a proprietary commercial grade database. So worth bearing in mind. So in terms of Microsoft and AWS, that's sort of a quick overview of its history and some of the core areas that you may want to focus in on around migration and how we can support. Thanks very much, and are we stopping for any questions at this stage?
You're on mute, Alistair.
Multiple mute buttons. Can't believe it. Fell for it. So that was fantastic. Thanks, Michael. I mean, that's a presentation I've seen multiple times now, and it never ceases to impress me. Particularly that slide with the hockey stick curve of services and offerings from you guys that really reinforces the fact that Microsoft technologies are a first-class citizen the AWS cloud. So lovely. I'm not seeing any questions coming in the chat. Again, if people have anything they'd like to ask in person, just indicate to me, make a little symbol, make a little signal in the chat box, or if you'd like to actually write an entire question, then feel free to do that as well. But I don't see anything coming in, so without any further ado, I'll hand over to my colleague, Alid Sage.
Excellent. Thanks, Alistair. So I've just got a few slides. We'll talk for about 5 minutes here. So to set the scene a little bit more before we go into the fireside chat. So first off, Microsoft applications are absolutely huge part of enterprise, and yet there's still so many of them running on-prem. So 70% of enterprise applications are Windows-based. 91% of enterprises are paying for some kind of SQL licensing, Windows Server licensing. And of those, a huge number of them are still running with ancient versions, be that SQL Server or Windows Server 2008 or older. Like 43% of those on-prem instances are running with those ancient versions. 82% of those Windows applications are still on-prem. So all those benefits of cloud that we could be getting around agility, handing over that undifferentiated heavy lifting to a company like AWS, all of those applications are not seeing those benefits because they still haven't migrated. But saying that, 50% of enterprises are planning to migrate those applications within the next 24 months. This slide is from 2019, so hopefully a good chunk of those enterprises will be a long way into that migration process. So looking at that same slide as Michael presented earlier, but focusing on that assessment stage is really, really important. So before we launch into migrating an application, we really need to make sure a few things. Like first off, to take full advantage of the cloud rather than treating the cloud as just a bunch of virtual machines, we really do need to embrace that at the company level. It's a transformation. Your finance team will need to be thinking about variable unpredictable spend. You'll need to think about training, about transformation of your company in order to take full advantage of this. So can you give your application team more responsibilities, or are they still going to throw it over the wall into some operations team for deployment? So all of these kind of things if you really want to make the most out of cloud. Then when you've identified an application to actually migrate, there's a lot of discovery there, particularly around making sure that you understand how that application is really being used, particularly if it's a legacy application. That migration process then gets us into AWS, but obviously that's not the end of the journey. This journey is to actually get the benefits of cloud fully, and for that we do need to optimize and we do need to modernize. So there's a lot of opportunity to take advantage of other AWS services, as well as to improve our architecture. And in that, Windows is at the heart of that enterprise IT transformation. So in terms of how that migration is done, so Michael mentioned the 7 Rs. This was just showing 6 of them. I'll talk about the 7th in a minute. We've got retire. So these going increasingly complex as we got up this list. So some applications just should not be migrated. Like we can retire these applications. In fact, some analysis done suggested that large enterprise could turn off 30% of their applications without anybody really noticing. Retain, some applications are just not worth migrating, either because they're just too gnarly and complicated to be the ones to focus on, or they're relying on weird proprietary hardware, or there's contracts being signed that mean for jurisdiction or whatever reasons you cannot migrate that. Other ones we could potentially just replace it by buying software as a service. So like, do we really need to run our own Exchange server rather than buying that as a service? So repurchase is often a better option than migrating your existing kit. Rehost is the next level. At that point, it's often referred to as a lift and shift. So we could move that application into the cloud, but we're not really re-architecting it. We're not changing the application. So we're going to get minimum benefits of cloud there. The next level of replatform is where we begin to get more of the benefits. So we are able to, say, switch out our F5 load balancer for an Elastic load balancer from AWS, we're able to stop managing our own databases and take advantage of AWS relational database service. That sort of re-platform did not involve big code changes, but it was beginning to give us a lot of those benefits of cloud, letting AWS deal with that undifferentiated heavy lifting. And the last one there, refactor, so that's where we actually are making a lot of code changes during that migration, potentially turning it into more of a cloud native application. You've got to be wary of that, in that if you spend too long refactoring, then you don't get to the cloud for a very long time, and potentially you lose the political buy-in from the execs because they're just seeing no benefits from this project. So it really depends on the nature of the application as to what is the right thing for your application. The seventh one that was added is if you want to stick with the existing platform that you're on, then we could move from a VMware estate that's on-prem to a VMware estate that's running in AWS. So AWS have partnership with VMware. That means that we could keep treating things with vSphere or vCenter and keep using that. Okay, back to you, Alistair.
Thanks very much, Alad. Yeah, obviously that resonates very well with the work we do with CloudSoft. And again, this is a presentation and a framework that I'm not unfamiliar with. I wonder if anyone has come across the 6 hours or the 7 hours of migration before now. It's a very good framework for working out the best path forward. Worth pointing out that for companies that have a large portfolio of different applications running on-prem or wherever they happen to be running, different migration strategies may be employed for different apps. Not all apps need to unlock the innovation that the cloud brings. Some apps are just intended to be sustained and just left running as they are. Anyway, great insights there, Alad. We're getting to the fun part of the. Not to say that your parts weren't fun, of course, but now we're approaching the fireside chat. So, if there are no questions on the 6 hours of migration, I'll talk about migration strategies. Again, I'm not seeing anything coming in on the chat window. Don't be shy, guys. Feel free to weigh in with comments or questions. But in the absence of that, we'll press on and we'll begin the fireside chat. So, we've got Dan and we've got Marcus. They haven't spoken so far. So, Dan, would you like to give us a little introduction to yourself and tell us a little bit about ASP events?
Yeah, sure. Can you all hear me, I suppose? My name's Dan. I'm the CTO of ASP. I've been with the company for around about 18 years. So, yeah, a lot longer. I'm responsible for the hosting and the application development, basically, of ASP's products and their services, and pretty much anything else technically in the business. So, when it comes to being a CTO, I'm very hands-on. I'm very passionate about sort of the hosting that we've got. Effectively, I really want to push our hosting and push our products to be the best possible, the best they possibly can. And I'm always keen to kind of adapt and use the latest technology. So a bit about ASP, we are an event website specialist. So we host around 350 websites for events and exhibitions globally. So no small fee. We like to think we're the industry experts in what we do, and we are very, very core to what our event organisers do. So we support around 120 clients. Again, they're based on every continent, and we've got established offices in sort of the UK and US. In terms of product, we run really kind of one major product, which is called Show Off, which is our application CMS. It's a SaaS product, and it's been specifically designed by an in-house development team that is specifically for event organisers. So that's a Java application that's kind of evolved over the last sort of 20 years. It's been a few iterations, and people can pick and choose elements of what they want, really. So that's kind of where we're at.
Mute.
Apologies, people. Thanks for that, Dan. That was a great intro. It was a show-off application stack that you migrated. It was running in a pair of data centers down in the Greater London area.
Yeah. So in the past, we've always had a kind of co-location environment. We've always started off as co-location. We then moved into technologies like VMware, etc. So for the last sort of 5 or 6 years, we were running VMware virtualized Microsoft applications on that. And yeah, we were actively hosting active across 2 geographically dispersed data centers. Does cause issues, I won't lie, but it was in a failover environment. So yeah.
I'm hoping that is a familiar scenario. It's certainly one we've encountered with other customers, and I'm sure it's not unfamiliar to folk on the call. Thanks for that. Marcus, hired gun, technical sharpshooter for hire. Give us an elevator pitch for who you are and the work you did for Insights.
Sure. Thanks, Alistair. So, yeah, my name is Marcus Corner. I typically work as a consultant, either in architecture, cloud migration, or more typically in kind of interim CTO, CIO roles. Currently working with Insights. So Insights is a global leader in self-awareness and people development solutions. So they have an enviable list of clients, some of the biggest names in the world for sport, pharmaceuticals, tech, all kinds of businesses. And Insights helps companies get the best out of their people. So they help increase individuals' understanding and self-awareness. So that's what Insights do, and they've been doing that very successfully for a long time. I joined them roughly a year ago to help with a number of different projects, but primarily their digital transformation, including their cloud migration.
Super duper. Thanks for that. I think it's tempting to talk technology when we think about migrations, but the migration work that we've done with you guys, it didn't happen in a vacuum. There was a very clear business context around the reasons for migrating. Dan, maybe start with you. Could you maybe pick out some of the main business drivers that caused ASP Events to decide that the cloud was the right place to be running show off?
I think primarily it was about the flexibility. We've always been allocation. We always had to buy a lot more kit than we actually probably needed to obviously cater for traffic spikes. And being an event at the moment, we've got this very real scenario where the beginning of the year is very busy, lots of traffic to data centers, lots of traffic to websites. That kind of tails off a little bit, and then sort of spring picks up again, lull over the summer, and kind of picks up again in the autumn. So we really needed a model that would kind of not give us the upfront cost of investment into hardware, but we could kind of scale up and scale down as we needed to. So the flexibility was probably a main driver. But kind of coupled with that was obviously reducing the cost as well, because obviously we'd have to buy a lot of hardware, put a lot of upfront investment into that. But by having this flexible model, we could effectively, during quiet periods, scale back our architecture and kind of scale back in what we need as well. Stability as well. I think being in a data center, and I know Michael talked a bit about kind of always on availability groups in Microsoft, that sort of thing. The maintenance and trying to configure that and maintain that in a data center, cross data center, is very difficult to do. So having a SQL outage where things did fail over, it never used to be seamless. There would always be some manual intervention that needed to happen, and that was a big kind of, to increase the stability of our architecture, was very good. And just the maintenance of it really as well. We talked about managing databases. I'm not a DBA. I don't want to be a DBA. It's nice to be able to use services where effectively that is taken away from us. And then it just allows us now to start to automate a lot more stuff that we couldn't really do without putting a lot of upfront investment into. So that's kind of what made our mind up, really.
Thanks, Dan. That's a lot of compelling advantages. Marcus, what were the business drivers that Insights felt were pertinent?
Yeah, so a lot of synergy with what Dan was saying there. So certainly scalability, flexibility. I think the primary drivers were really around how they release their products, how rapidly they can release it, the environments that they release to, and being able to spin up new environments so that they could test new deployments and test new features much more rapidly. So previously, Insights were hosted with a very traditional data center provider, where creating new environments would be very time consuming and difficult to do. So yeah, a lot of reasons like that and more, but primarily around the cadence of their development, I think.
Super, very good. And Marcus, why was AWS the choice of target cloud? I think there's almost an unspoken assumption by a lot of people who work in the Microsoft realm, who maybe work with the .NET stack, or who are heavily invested in Windows Server or SQL Server, that there is another cloud which has a great gravity that is drawing them towards that. Why did Insights consider AWS over Azure?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So whenever you're doing this kind of work, and I've done this kind of migration work for quite a few businesses, I think you need to look at every aspect of the migration in the round. So that might start with, which cloud providers are you currently working with? You might have other teams that are familiar with a particular cloud provider. And you might have providers that you're strategically planning to use in different parts of the business. You might also need to think about, once this system is migrated, how will you manage that application? Who will be the people in your business who are going to look after this application? So if you're moving from a traditional data center, then it's probably quite likely that your data center provider is managing some of your application today. Maybe they're managing the databases and the network layer, because you might not have the skills in-house. So when you start thinking about support, you need to think, okay, well, if I'm going to build my own support team, if I'm going to recruit or however you're going to do that, what are the skill sets in the area that you work that you can recruit for? Is it as easy to pick someone to recruit someone who has AWS skills as it is any other cloud? So I think you have to weigh up all of those things together. And only once you've done that can you really make a choice. It's really not as simple as saying, I've got an application which runs on stack X, therefore I'm going to choose cloud provider Y. It really doesn't work like that. There's a lot of different ingredients that go into that decision.
Very good. No disagreement from me, of course. Dan, was there a compelling reason to choose AWS?
Again, it's a really good question. Considering that we were very reliant on Microsoft technologies, very Windows Server orientated, it made sense for us to, a lot of people would think, just move to Azure. It didn't necessarily work like that, and we looked at it, and actually, in my view, AWS was a bit more established. It was a bit more kind of, when we were looking initially, it was all about the AWS cloud that was coming along. So I think from the outset, we always preferred an AWS solution. The probably compelling reason for me was that the depth of services that we could effectively utilize, and not necessarily just for the Microsoft stack, but for future, and looking into the future about actually what we could adapt and automate and also use to make our application that bit better. It seemed more established on AWS than it would be on any other cloud provider, really. So that was kind of where we got to. And I think after having chats with yourselves and some others as well, actually Microsoft is very well supported on AWS as well, which kind of lent us that way. Yeah, very well. I think we saw that in Michael's material. Is there anything else you'd like to come in with at this point, Michael? You've obviously given us a nice detailed picture on the offerings, but any specific stuff you'd like to call out in response?
Yeah, I think some really good points have already been raised, particularly, Dan, you mentioned the depth of services, not just within the Microsoft stack, but elsewhere. I think customers choose AWS really because of that functionality. We have 175 fully featured services, and, that can now support virtually any type of cloud workload, whether it's compute, storage, databases, machine learning, artificial intelligence, Internet of Things, virtual augmented reality. It goes on and on. So I think you're absolutely right there. That breadth and depth of services is really important if you're looking to innovate on behalf of your customers. And that innovation is only increasing. It's exponential. There's some really cool stats here around. Back in 2011, we released 80 or so services. 2012, 160 services and features. And then you go to reInvent, or you look at some of the collateral and announcements we're making, and in 2019 I think it was around 1,900 odd features and services that we released. So that level of innovation and is what, and that's all driven by our customers typically, and the feedback we get from our customers asking for new services, new ways of doing things, so that they can innovate. Some really core points to raise. And just one last point, I think it's important to talk about that experience. So AWS have been running Microsoft workloads since sort of 2011. And that unmatched of experience, maturity really shines through, I think, for a lot of customers. And we have an internal phrase: "There's no compression algorithm for experience." You only learn certain lessons in how you scale when you reach those milestones. And if we have 2.5 times the amount of customers running Microsoft workloads on AWS than our nearest the nearest provider, then you can sort of see how that gets established in terms of experience.
Yeah, thanks for that. We have a question from David Burnett, who asks why you think AWS is getting such large growth in Microsoft customers, Microsoft users moving to AWS. And presumably you're seeing an exponential growth in users just as much as you're providing an exponential growth in services. Why do we think AWS has people flocking to it in droves?
So for me on that one, I think a lot of enterprise-sized businesses are doing their kind of migrations in two parts. So the parts of their businesses that host the customer-facing applications probably moved to the cloud some time ago, and their first choice might have been AWS for that. When it comes to the some of the back-end systems, now that AWS is so strong in those Microsoft technologies, it makes sense to simply consolidate and move your enterprise workloads to AWS as well. So I think there are plenty of businesses are doing a kind of split cloud strategy, but there are so many who are familiar with AWS for their product technology that they're moving their enterprise tech there as well.
Very good. Alex, you get any insights into some of this stuff?
Yeah, so great points already. I'll try not to repeat those ones too much. I think it's worth noting, so none of these big cloud providers is a bad choice. But saying that, it's very telling that AWS is by far the biggest cloud provider in the market, and twice as many Windows workloads on AWS as there are on Azure. It's also when trying to compare these sizes and amount of business they got, the cloud revenue numbers, Azure did a brilliant piece of marketing by including all of their Office 365 revenue as cloud to get a huge revenue number. And if you unpack that and actually look at the cloud as we're talking about here, then AWS still dominate in a big way. And they've been running these services at huge scale for a long time. I also love that quote from Andy Jassy: "If there's no compression algorithm for experience, you can't learn certain lessons without going through the curve." There's some things you can learn from other people. So you can compress. Azure have done a brilliant job of releasing excellent services in Azure, and they've learned that from AWS. The developer experience is also really good in Azure, and they've learned that from popular DevOps tools and practices. But things like the operations, the scalability, the reliability, those are really hard problems. And Azure have had some recent capacity issues in some of the regions in the last few months. And they've had to prioritize customers related to COVID-19 work, for example. They've also had more outages. And one of the reasons for that is if we think about what Michael said of those availability zones, each availability zone is multiple data centers, and then you've got multiple availability zones in a region. Compare that with some Azure regions are a single colocation data center. So it's not owned by Microsoft, it's not multiple availability zones. And therefore just your chance of outages, your ability to write robust, reliable, high available applications is less. And also then just running a hyperscale public cloud service reliably, it's a very hard problem. And AWS has been doing that since 2006 for public cloud offerings. One last thing I'd say on the choice of cloud. So as an AWS advanced partner, we work closely with AWS to get the most for our customers. And AWS do have a lot of funding programs. So these include for migration, adopting new AWS services, modernizing your application. So those are definitely worth taking advantage of. So recommend speaking to an AWS partner such as CloudSoft or to your AWS account manager if you have one.
Yeah, all excellent points. I'm seeing a question coming in from Ludo, who it ties in very nicely with my next question. My next question was going to be about the assessment and preparation phases that you showed in one of your slides, Alad, and you did as well, Michael. Before the migration, there's actually a surprising amount of work to be done, although as technology bods, we always think about the bits and the bytes and the databases and the virtual machines, but there's so much more to it than that. Marcus, let's start with you. At Insights, what was involved in that assessment and planning piece, the preparation piece? Ludo's also asking if careful planning and then doing the migration all at once is the best way to proceed, or if there are more piecemeal approaches that can work well. I think there's maybe the same question being asked in two different ways.
Yeah, sure. So for my work with Insights, Insights spent a great deal of time doing, I guess, two parts to this. So understanding their tech architecture and the tech infrastructure that was used today. So the application has been sitting in the same data center for quite a while. So we needed to really understand exactly how that worked. But from a business perspective, it was about pulling together stakeholders who could assist with all the different questions that we would go through on the way to that migration. So that would be, like legal, security, customer services, lots of other departments. We pulled together a virtual team to understand exactly what the migration would mean and all the different levels of compliance that we'd need to meet, whether that's legal compliance, security compliance, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, a large virtual team of people who could assist with the entire migration. To Ludo's question, I think whether you go for a big bang approach or start to slipstream some of these AWS services into your existing app, I think that really depends on what your application is and what it does. I've used both approaches. Insights did a big bang approach, but in other businesses that I've worked with, it would be extremely difficult and risky to do a big bang. So they've started to migrate very small microservices over to AWS and have the two systems running alongside each other. I think really, I don't think there's a good answer to that unless you know exactly what that application is, what it does, and what the risks involved are. But there's certainly merits to both, I think. Very good.
Dan, the pre-migration prep work?
Yeah, I think we were... In terms of assessment, I think because we've been building the same application and maintaining the same application for the last 15, 20 years, we didn't necessarily have the understanding of what we needed to do in that data center. It's something that I've evolved over the course of that time. And I think we knew from an early stage, and we nearly made a move about 4 or 5 years ago, but we felt we weren't quite ready, and the cloud wasn't quite ready for us as well. In terms of assessment, I think just again, taking that down into fine detail and actually working out, right, what service is this going to be replaced with? What service can I use with that? We just kind of hopefully meticulously planned every element of that and went through different options. We looked at, okay, what if we did lift and shift? This is what we could use. What if we didn't lift and shift? This is what we could use. And looked at possible migration strategies, and probably to jump onto Ludo's question, we did go big bang. We felt we had to do that. That was the only way we could do it. We had to move all 350 odd sites in one go. There was no other way of doing that. So again, very meticulous planning around how we would do that. That being said, we did have a gotcha probably about 2 weeks before with some limitations around database licensing. But again, these problems are there to challenge us and overcome. So if anything, that's really shaped the way we've done stuff since we moved across. So, but just a lot of planning really, and a lot of kind of talking up front.
Do Alad or Michael want to jump in now? I'm happy to keep moving forward.
I'd stress that it requires that buy-in from the top down. If you don't have top-down buy-in, you're basically just doing a shadow IT project. Yeah. And that planning and preparation at the business level is so important. What Marcus talked about of that virtual team of lots of different stakeholders is brilliant. Finance are going to have to start dealing with unpredictable costs when they used to fixed costs amortized over 3 years. It's an entirely different way of thinking about the world. And you can't just throw that upon them. You need to actually involve them in this journey. Simply that shift of responsibilities from application developers and the people who are deploying this infrastructure increasingly get more responsibility for that infrastructure, the networking and security decisions. That's a big cultural shift. If you just view it as a tech project, then you're setting yourself up for a lot of problems with how operations are then going to work in the cloud.
That's an excellent point, Alan, and it's a point that comes to the fore as we start to engage more with the FinOps community, that customers who can actually save money will balk at the fact that it's variable month to month, and they'll throw a fit, and they'll not want to do it, even though it will cost them less. The fact it costs them a different amount each month throws them on a wobbler. That almost segues perfectly into my next question. You may have half answered it already, around the business and company, the cultural and people and process challenges, the non-technical aspects that you encountered in doing the cloud move. Do you have any tips for those who are listening around how to carry business stakeholders with you on the journey, how to bring them along? Alan's mentioned finance, Marcus, you've mentioned security. We know that there's often a split brain between dev and ops. How do we bring the ops guys along? Do you have any tips for overcoming business and company level challenges, Marcus?
I think in my experience, it's really about bringing them along. So the example Alan gave was perfect. So the finance teams are going to be used to dealing with probably exactly the same invoice every month from their existing provider, and that will change massively. So bringing them along so that they understand actually how their bills will look, how to deal with any kind of taxes that they're going to see, how to register each of the accounts in a way that makes sure your billing is as efficient as possible. Thinking about security and legal, it's very much about understanding what compliance is required today and how you can meet or better that compliance in future. So, for example, you might have a privacy policy that you publish that says everything you host is in the UK. Now, of course, you can match that in AWS, but only if you choose the right regions and you make the right decision. So I think it's about bringing everybody along for the journey.
Yeah, good stuff. Knowing what we know about ASP events, Dan, I think you're a key part of the business. You've been there as long as almost anybody, and you're CEO. You're very fortunate to work with a very empowering, very open-minded CEO. Were there any business challenges?
Yeah, I say like you say, we were very lucky in the fact that from the start, effectively, the kind of top level management and especially our CEO Aaron, who is listening, was very kind of driven towards moving to the cloud. So in terms of getting stakeholder buy-in, things like that, it was there already. We didn't need to necessarily put a lot of effort into that. In terms of operations, I guess one of the challenges we had was changing the processes and things like that. So it's to onboard a site potentially might have a slightly different way of doing things than it was when we were on premise. That's fine, but it was about getting the buy-in from those other departments that were going to interact with it on a day-to-day basis to say, well, actually, look, here's a bit of a trade-off at the moment, but we were working towards automating that and moving it forward. So again, getting them involved early. Ultimately, we found as long as it works, a lot of people didn't necessarily care. They just want a working system at the end of the day that is built and is the best ability they can do. So from my perspective, I felt quite lucky in that sense that we could move things around a little bit and adapt as and when we see fit, as long as we had that long journey in place to get to the end goal of as much automation as possible.
Fantastic, yeah. I'm sure a lot of people are envying your position, having that flexibility, that remit. We are talking about Microsoft here, and were there any aspects of the fact that it was Microsoft technologies that added complexity or made things more difficult, or on the flip side, actually made things easier in terms of migrating into the cloud? Dan?
I wouldn't say easier. So our hosting, because we were very kind of on-premise, very heavy reliant on Microsoft, it actually gave us a few challenges that we really did need to overcome. So we used to run a lot of Active Directory to manage kind of access and passwords, things like that, obviously, which wasn't an easy lift and shift. So it actually started to give us the questions, do we actually need to run Active Directory? Do we need to do this? So we started to look at other alternatives around that. In terms of file servers, we had it was a DFS file share that we used to share across a number of servers to replicate static content. And again, how could we interact that with a Windows server? So we looked at things like the FSX kind of file system and that as well, really. And then it was pretty much a given that we were going to use RDS for SQL Server. That was always going to be a thing. But again, I talked about this earlier about limitations of licensing. So again, depends on the instance size, depends on how many databases you can have per instance of RDS. And again, that was a gotcha. We had 160 databases and we had a limit of about 50, which meant we needed to kind of exponentially increase the number of instances we had there. But it really, it definitely around the file system anyway was probably the more complicated thing. And I didn't want to have something that was massively complicated in the cloud to maintain. So in the end, we effectively kind of started to change a few things around. So, but yeah, I'd say more complexities than anything.
Yeah. And Marcus, obviously .NET and SQL Server, Microsoft pervades the entire stack.
Yes.
At Insights, what challenges or accelerators did that provide?
I think it was similar to Dan's experience, actually. So we had a few technical issues with the Active Directory integration, but of course having the managed SQL Server for RDS and multi-AZ SQL Server for RDS was a great benefit and takes a lot of the kind of operational concerns out of the picture, which was great. But yeah, so probably a very similar experience to Dan. I wouldn't say it was any more or less difficult than doing it with a different stack. It's just a different challenge, I think.
Sure. Very good. One of the things Dan mentioned there was licenses, which ties in quite nicely with the question we've had from the floor, the virtual floor. Neil Morris asks about considerations that should be given to Microsoft licenses, not just in AWS, but across cloud providers. Are there constraints when moving to AWS? I guess underlying that, he asks, how can we stop spending as much on Microsoft licenses? I'll throw that one at Michael first.
Yeah, thanks, Alistair. Yeah, it's a common conversation topic, particularly during that assessment phase. If you've already got an existing bank of licenses that you're utilizing, you may have maintenance on those for a number of years, and you may want to continue using them. So, but also you want to leverage and utilize some of the core or native AWS services. So where do we start really in terms of understanding the migration strategy around licensing? And it goes back to sort of some of the core points I mentioned in the presentation really. AWS provides you with flexibility, so you can bring licenses over to AWS if you have that license mobility benefit with software assurance, whether that's to our EC2 environment for things like SQL Server. If you don't have software assurance or you don't have that license mobility, you can still bring SQL Server across to something like dedicated hosts. So there is that flexibility there. And then typically customers will look at ways in which they can modernize that environment and look to reduce costs, whether it's to move to Aurora, whether it's to break up the data layer and move to a data warehouse solution, to something extremely cost effective like S3 or look at Redshift. And that's really where you can unlock the infinite scalability of AWS and its services. So I think that's, if you're looking to reduce that overall licensing total cost of ownership, it's that assessment phase, understanding where you are today, your application life cycles, what your strategy is in terms of bring your own or acquire through AWS, and then looking to modernize from that point.
It's an interesting point you make, because the ASP approach was actually to remove Microsoft as much as possible, switching to Linux, not just for licensing reasons, but to simplify some operations. The ASP approach has been to still stick with Microsoft. I believe, maybe Marcus, you can talk. I think you guys are talking about running .NET Core on Linux. Is that a project that's happening?
So I think there's a number of different things happening at Insights from a dev perspective, which I'm not close enough to go into to give you a lot of detail. But yeah, lots of things are being considered. Let's say that. Fair point.
Ross has popped up on the chat to ask about. We often say now that cloud is not about saving money; it's about making money. It's about accelerating the pace of innovation, and that's a message that came through very clearly from Michael and Marcus and Dan. what innovations specifically are being unlocked now that your workloads are running in the cloud, specifically in AWS? I'll fire that one at Dan.
Again, it's happening at quite an exponential pace. I think given the fact that some decisions were made to try and simplify stuff on move, so we started off really with very heavily Windows, and like I say, we've moved very much to a Linux environment now and really adopting techniques like that. But in terms of innovations, we've already been through a process of refactoring all our code. We now run Aurora. So we've moved away from SQL Server to that. So we've refactored to MySQL and Aurora. We are just external to Microsoft. We've effectively adopted WAF and Shield. So we're in a process at the moment of migrating those away. So we've actually kind of looking at that. So we're adapting and consolidating back into AWS. Moving storage as well. So we talked about FSX kind of file systems. We actually opted for EFS in the end and a Linux platform, but kind of really moving that now to S3 and taking advantage of S3 and CloudFront and really kind of using those areas there really. So we're really adopting the Amazon feel and how we look at everything now. So it's what service can we use to do that, rather than kind of, okay, we need to build a service to potentially do that. So it's kind of, I think having those database problems initially when we first migrated has really kind of pushed us on to drive and get that kind of conversion to Aurora done and dusted and out of the way, so we can start to save the money and look elsewhere and speed up development.
Thanks for that. We're going deep into the weeds of licensing. I think Ronnie has posted a question in the chat asking about the license mobility program, software assurance license mobility that Microsoft offered. I think they recently made some really quite aggressive moves against third-party providers such as AWS having as much flexibility in offering Microsoft licenses. They can obviously offer very attractive licensing arrangements within their own cloud, but what's changed recently, Michael, around the software assurance that Microsoft used to offer for on-prem license portability?
Yeah, so there was a change on the 1st of October last year. So for any licenses acquired after that date, you won't be able to bring those across to AWS without having software assurance or license mobility in place. So, as with anything Microsoft licensing focused, we'll work with our customers, put a strategy in place to make that deployment, if it is the case that you've purchased those licenses after the 1st of October, and move those as best we can. So yeah, it was a change that was made by Microsoft, and AWS is aware of it, and we're working with customers to migrate as effectively as we can.
Great stuff. Thanks for that. These are great questions, by the way, folks. Keep them coming in on the chat. Both Dan and Marcus, both the applications we've spoken about were legacy, which has often some negative connotations, but I mean that in the nicest possible way. There were well-established, successful applications that have been in service for decades, multiples of decades, because they're successful, because they're delivering business value. I think the Insights application in particular have been around for maybe 15 years over several versions of .NET. We know from conversations with customers that often makes things really difficult to move. They grow barnacles, they grow roots. What advice would you have for folk maybe listening who have an application that fits that mold and they think maybe cloud migration's unreachable? Specifically, Marcus.
So I think, it's a really good question. I think when you consider the age of the application and also where it's been situated and for how long, they are definitely functions of complexity, in terms of the migration itself. So the longer something's been somewhere, the less likely it is to be fully documented. And like you say, there might have been changes made to those applications that have gone in for, meant to be a short-term fix and have then lived on, but haven't been perfectly detailed. I think when you've got that kind of application, there's only a certain amount of planning that you can actually do up front. So I don't think it's viable to set out at the start exactly how everything is going to work and how everything is going to be configured from the start. That tends not to work well when you've got something that's long-lived. You're bound to find something along the way that trips you up, and it's going to be more of a journey of technical discovery. And that's one of the reasons why we Insights partnered with Cloudsoft. We wanted some help with that kind of heavy lifting of some of those parts of the application. So Insights took a really sensible and mature approach in saying they were going to take an outcome-focused approach to that migration, so that we would have the time to resolve and make, not only do a lift and shift, but also make significant improvements to the application during the migration as well. So I think to answer that a bit more succinctly, it'll probably take longer, and you'll probably find more problems.
No surprises there. Yeah. Dan, also show off as a long history of successful user growth. Did that add any complications?
I think it's just, it was more around kind of, again, like Marcus says, it's about finding those little bits that there's always going to be a gotcha somewhere, and it's always going to be, you're never going to get the perfect migration. I think that's probably one of the things that we realised fairly early on, that there would always be some element of, okay, we need to fix this, and we need to fix this now after we've gone live. But it's just about trying to minimise that as much as possible, really. There will always be something that, like I say, has been put in as a temporary fix that effectively has sat there for a long time, and you only realise once you start to lift it. So, I mean, if there's anything, it would be, obviously you can plan for so much, but test is probably the key.
Yeah, and I think we had some good success with doing things iteratively to try and reduce the risk. Obviously, there were still some things we found out relatively late in the day, but I think we were able to learn as we went.
Exactly. I think as long as you learn from those mistakes, then that's all you can really do. Yeah.
You've both mentioned lift and shift, Marcus and Dan, and that ties in with Alad's description of the 7 R's, rehosting versus replatforming. Dan, which of those two camps do you think the show-off migration fell into?
Probably about 3 of them. We started off, I think early on, we wanted to effectively lift and shift as much as possible. I think that was always the plan, was to, we had a need to move away from our ISP. We wanted to move away from our ISP. We had a perfect window of the summer where it would be a bit quieter, so we kind of started the process about sort of 6 months before, with a plan to just lift and shift. And I think it quickly turned from a lift and shift to potentially looking at rehosting some services. So we were then looking at RDS. And I think, given the fact that we didn't want to have something too complicated to kind of start building and have to change later, it quickly turned into more of a re-platform a few elements. So we moved from a Windows to a Linux web server, Apache, iOS, etc. We then adopted a network file share, EFS, instead of using FSX and kind of Windows shares. So it slowly started to snowball. So I'd say we probably touched all 3, really, kind of a rehost, replatform, and refactor. But we wanted to keep it simple when we got there, really, so we could start our cloud journey better.
That's great. Before I come to Marcus, just to ping Michael, in your experience, what do most AWS migration customers choose first or ultimately?
Yeah, so I speak to a lot of customers, and it really does depend on that particular application you have in mind. So during that assessment phase, we need to understand the life cycle, its roadmap, your resources as well around, when you're going through that migration and mobilize phase, how long is that phase going to be, what resources are available, and what that will allow us to understand is what the target environment may look like. So all of those factors will focus in on whether you can move to something like RDS, because post migration you may not want to manage the underlying infrastructure or have the capacity to do so. You may leverage things like Windows FSX. Going back to it, it really depends on that particular application. And you talked a little bit there, Alistair, about legacy in a positive way, and understanding that that life cycle. So even if you're running end of life, operating systems, and that happens all the time. We talk to customers who have that situation. We can still migrate that application, and we can still work within that, those applications that have been in situ for a very long time. So there are mechanisms we have in play that can support any type of application across those 7 Rs.
That's an interesting thing you make about end-of-life operating system versions. I think there are a lot of long-lived legacy apps that are still running on completely unsupported versions of Windows. Does containerization technology help kind of isolate the operating system in the cloud? Are there any mechanisms that AWS supports?
Yeah, so we have some programs around that, and I think it's something that it's worth discussing with AWS and with CloudSoft as well. It's an area we can investigate, and it can really help during that assessment phase, leveraging some of those programs. So the end of life migration program is great in that sense. It's publicly available on our website and can really help package up those applications that are running on things like 2003 or 2008.
Fantastic. Marcus, on the subject of rehost versus replatform, how did that break down with Insights?
Yeah, so it was an interesting one. So for the actual core of the application, it was probably a replatform, so not a vast amount changed there. However, for all the ancillary stuff around the application, it was a refactor. There was a desire to make a number of significant improvements, both in networking, security, and to utilize a lot of the out-of-the-box AWS tools rather than writing services themselves. So a mixture of refactor and replatform, probably falling into the majority of refactor. I think only the core application actually remained the same.
That's interesting. Very good. Aled, any advice on the different approaches for anyone who may be considering migrating, dipping a toe in the cloud waters?
Just to stress, there's no single right answer. It really does depend on your application. It depends on your organization as well. Like, are you used to moving quickly and making changes quickly and safely? On balance, don't change too much when migrating to the cloud. You can then change things later. But saying that, sometimes when you actually do your audit of how your application looks, then things aren't actually acceptable in their current state to migrate it. So we've come across customers who they've taken the migration to cloud as an opportunity to do a pen test because they want to make sure the cloud is safe. And a whole bunch of stuff that it highlights is actually about the application, not about the cloud. And do you just ignore those because you're in the process of trying to do a rehost? Well, not really. You fix stuff. So you prioritize those, and it turns out the whole bunch of other changes then happen at the same time. Similarly, if you're running SQL Server 2008, are you really going to start running SQL Server 2008 in AWS? There's pros and cons of that, but really it's an opportunity as well to modernize and go to a newer version of it. And that is a big temptation to make those changes. And completely agree with what Dan said of test. If that is working for you, then it's a brilliant chance to do that some of that modernization along the way.
It's an interesting point you raised, because I'm aware that Insights specifically had a very belt and braces failback plan, very carefully, meticulously detailed for what would happen to the application stack, which has, as you point out, a great many blue chip clients. There's a lot of reputational risk hanging on this service being available and working well. So I think you had a plan in place that would allow you to fall back to the old hosting site if anything went catastrophically wrong, which of course it didn't. Tell us a bit about that. What did that entail, and how nervous were people?
Yeah, sure. So there was a goal really to be able to switch back to the existing infrastructure provider very, very rapidly. So during day one, or worst case scenario at the end of day one, and we had a number of kind of acceptance criteria as to say whether or not that would happen. It would be a very specific call that was made to say if certain metrics haven't been met, then we're going to switch back over. So we experimented with AWS's DMS, the Database Migration Service, to replicate data between AWS and the traditional hosting provider, and we tried a number of different technical solutions to do that failback. In the end, the actual failback itself would have simply been a backup and restore of some description, because we didn't have all the success that we really wanted with some of the other options. And this was, without going into a whole load of detail, this was we were moving quite a large number of database versions when we went from the old host to AWS. In the end, it came down to a risk decision. So we accepted the risk that there might be a day one failback, and we mitigated that with additional testing and basically having the application largely offline for the weekend of migration to test it thoroughly before the Monday go live.
Excellent. So Dan, you also considered failback. You also considered, the risk of catastrophic failure, small as it was. What was your approach to the actual go live in the cloud?
It was very, very similar to what Marcus has kind of detailed. Really, it was. I mean, a lot of our clients want their. We're very much mainly B2B, but we've got some B2C as well, which is obviously doesn't really give us a lot of time to do stuff. Our biggest problem is trying to find a window where we could effectively migrate sort of 150 databases across with very minimal downtime. So again, we looked into things like the DMS. Again, we had problems trying to convert and get across where things weren't necessarily quite right. So we in the end opted for effectively a backup and restore. We found that to be the quickest way. So effectively take stuff offline, back it up, restore it into AWS. In terms of rehosting and things like that, we're very lucky in the fact that we had an external proxy as a WAF, so we could effectively point to either AWS or our existing hosting. So we had that failback plan in place should we find errors within there. But again, in terms of failback, it was almost, if it didn't quite work and when we brought things back online, we tested and data didn't verify successfully, we would have backed out then. I think once it came back online and we got to the Monday, or actually the Sunday for some of our Dubai clients, there really was no going back. It was very much a case of we fix in place and push through it. So that's kind of what we did and very successfully did so.
So apps that have lived a long time do accumulate a lot of data, whether that's relational data in a SQL database or whether it's file system data. And I know, Dan, that your platform supports both. You have a lot of relational and a lot of assets sitting on a file system. How did you go about migrating those? You've mentioned, the panel has mentioned the database migration service, and you've previously mentioned S3. So
yeah, we're actually hosting on EFS at the moment, so we still have a network share there. But to migrate, we had something like 600-700 gigs worth of sort of static content that we needed to migrate. So in the end, we actually opted for data sync. So we deployed an agent locally in VMware and effectively pushed the data across in data sync in chunks. And that kind of allowed us to migrate a lot of the static content beforehand, so we could start to verify things and ahead of the actual planned migration. So that worked quite well in that sense. So we had all that static asset there already. And obviously we'll now use the data sync again to push that back into S3 to migrate that over when we're ready to go. So again, it was very much a lift and shift, and then we'll look to adopt that later.
Oh yeah, saw you nodding your head there, Marcus. Does that pattern sound familiar to you?
Yeah, very much so. Probably similar levels of data, and I think for our migration itself, a relatively simple backup and restore. So we practiced that incessantly to make sure that there was confidence in the processes and the timescales. In all of those kind of migration scenarios were practiced.
Yeah. Any general advice, Aled, as someone who's seen this in numerous customers?
Yeah, keep it as simple as you can get away with. So if you've got time to be able to do that, taking your writes offline in your existing data center, taking a copy of the database, shipping it across to a new environment, and so on. Like doing it like that is just so much easier to practice, reason about, and do. Like if you really need to get as close to zero downtime as possible, services like the database migration service is great. But yeah, you got to be careful with it. There's some excellent technical advice out there as to how to get it working. Like it's so easy to get sucked into the weeds of trying to get that stuff working, performant, across the right versions. So yeah, keep it simple.
Excellent, thanks. On the operations side, obviously operations is very different when you're working with a data center provider versus a cloud provider, maybe with a partner in the mix. Marcus, can you tell us how AWS kind of day-to-day operations have changed? Things like incident response or monitoring or just day-to-day ops stuff. How's that different for Insights before the migration happened?
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, Insights were reliant on their data center provider for quite a lot of that operational support, including the kind of database support. Insights have decided to build their own DevOps team internally to manage that. They're using a variety of AWS tools for the monitoring. They also have some application performance monitoring in the shape of AppDynamics. So they've basically become partially self-sufficient. We're obviously still partnered, or Insights are still partnered with CloudSoft for the support of the application on a 24/7 basis, because Insights aren't quite ready for the 24/7 service themselves yet. So it's been quite a sizable shift from their previous fully managed solution to moving to a lot of self-service.
And how about at ASP, Dan?
In terms of day-to-day operations, I'd actually say it's kind of, we've taken back control of a few bits that we didn't necessarily have before. So in terms of, a lot was put into the fact that obviously, again, a bit like Marcus, being in that data center environment, that managed environment, we were used to having things like the network taken care of, the VMware taken care of, the kind of the infrastructure side of things taken care of, and even to some degree, some database level DBA help as well. And I think coming to AWS and kind of using RDS and using things like this, we've effectively taken back some of that control now, because we have some of that control. We can set the VPC up, we can use different services. We've got probably a bit more transparency we had into issues and things like that we never really had with that provider, because they would mask a lot of that. And I think being able to see that is definitely better. So I do feel we've taken back control. I've also said before that we've effectively made sacrifices in some places where some of our kind of the day-to-day stuff we do is effectively kind of it's increased in load, but we've saved elsewhere with a view to that. We always knew we'd take that initial hit and migrate and modernise later to make that better. So where we've saved, we've probably taken a hit in some places, but generally we've taken back a bit of control and automated a lot more, really, I think, since.
Very good. Take back control. Nobody mentioned Brexit. Alex, obviously, I think the guys have both dropped a hint that CloudSoft helps with the operational side of things, but without turning this into a sales pitch, of course. Can you maybe give a little bit more colour to that?
Yeah, so we work closely with our customers there. We aim to complement and extend their skills. So our CloudSoft engineers are experts in cloud automation applications. That is a sales pitch, really. But but importantly, when people are migrating to cloud, they might well be looking to train up their own teams, recruit more, but that's hard. And to complement that with working with a partner like CloudSoft is a good way to ensure that there are skills available, particularly with that 24/7 support that we offer to investigate problems, in that there's so many moving pieces in an AWS solution compared with an on-prem environment, really. Particularly when you're trying to take advantage of cloud and elasticity, and there's different data stores involved, and as you modernize applications as well, potentially you're moving to a whole different load of different compute platforms that you're using. So many different moving pieces means that some of those skills to monitor, manage, and automate requires that AWS expertise. We also find that by keeping close to the customers there, giving that 24/7 support means we're in a position where we can recommend architectural improvements and other kinds of improvements that will improve the functioning and future of our applications.
Yes, very good. And you mentioned the skills gap there and the potential difficulty in recruiting or even training and upskilling existing employees. How have you found that at ASP and at Insights? Dan, maybe you go first. How have you found recruiting for cloud skills?
We haven't, to be honest, for the moment. It's been about a year now that we've been kind of reliant on AWS, but I think a lot of it has come from in-house. So I've done a couple of courses, and I think dealing quite closely with effectively you as a partner, I've not needed to necessarily get that expertise in. So I think, again, we've got some basic understanding within our organisation of what AWS is and kind of how it works, and effectively we're imparting the wisdom of yourselves really on the rest of the team that are involved in that. So there will become a time where I think we will recruit for some specialisms, but yeah, it will be a bit more difficult and probably a bit more costly.
I think you're hiding your light under a bushel. I think we know that you didn't just do you haven't just done a couple of courses. I think you passed your AWS solution architect exam with flying colours this week.
Yes, yes.
Doing yourself a disservice.
But again, that's just being hands-on. I think it's nice to. I like to do that sort of thing, and I think if we can do that and kind of impart that wisdom, there will become a point where we do need to get that help in. I just feel like it's nice to make these steps at the moment as the team we've got, and feel we've got the accomplishment and achievement of actually doing what we set out to do in the first place.
Yeah. Any advice for others, Marcus, on the upskilling?
I think it won't be a surprise to anybody on the call that the skills that people are looking to recruit for in the DevOps space are in very, very high demand across the UK. So yes, there's lots of good training resources out there for people who want to get involved with this and upskill themselves on AWS services. I think it's also important to know that even if you are a developer who's somewhat removed from the hosting on which the application you work on resides, I think it's really important that those people become familiar with how AWS and those systems work. I think that's a really good, it's just good practice for developers to get involved and understand what they eventually write, how that eventually lands and works and is hosted and interacts. But yeah, it won't be a surprise for anybody that those skills are in super high demand.
Yeah, that's certainly our experience as well. Okay, thanks, chaps. We are approaching the end of our time slot. I've not seen many questions coming through. That's not to say you're out of time for asking questions. I think I've got one more question I want to ask the guys, which may prompt some discussion and some Q&A. But before I do that, I'm just going to pop this back on the screen just to remind you all that is this sharing? It is not. Let me try that again. So let's do this. So again, just recapping the Fireside chat, we'll have some open Q&A. There's no hard stop, but we are approaching the end of our time. But I do want to leave this on screen so that just to remind you that we are running virtual, brief, open sessions, surgery sessions where you can come and chat. If that's of interest to you or other people in your organisation, please do spread the word. I'll leave that on screen just while I ask my final question, and it's, events like this are a great way to share kind of battle stories and tales from the trenches. Are there any other than the ones we've spoken about, were there any other technical challenges that cropped up that reared their heads during the migration or the running the application in the cloud? Any tales you'd like to share? Dan, sorry to put you on the spot.
That's all right. I think being running a kind of SaaS product and definitely dealing with web and the way that kind of Google want everything secure now, and I completely agree with that. One of the biggest challenges for us is kind of, or was trying to leverage how we could use existing AWS services to host 350 secure websites. And I think that presented some challenges around kind of limits in terms of certificates per load balancer, that sort of thing. So again, it's just, again, trying to work out all of those kind of extra little bits really that you've kind of got into. Also trying to kind of just, it's a change of mindset in how you use, like if you're very much used to an on-premise environment about kind of, okay, you to do a post-mortem, you effectively look at the logs of the servers, you can kind of come in, you fix the server that you're there to then bring that back online. And in AWS, effectively the way we've kind of looked at it and you approach it is you need to have things that are recreatable. So it's a case of, it's actually easier in some senses that actually you just terminate a server and build a new one. It's changing that mindset of how you do things that really kind of, you have to get the buy-in from people to do.
Yeah. Marcus?
Yeah, it's similar lines to Dan. I think not so much a war story as such. I'd happily share those another time, probably over a beer when we're all somewhat back to more normality. But the top tips, I guess, for running this for any kind of migration to a cloud provider would be around not just planning the migration itself, but all of the working practices that you need to get in place to make sure that it's going to be successful afterwards. So as Dan was saying, it's things like if you're going to move to a cloud provider, you probably want to be thinking about offsite logging. You want to be thinking about immutable infrastructure. You want to be thinking about your CI/CD pipelines, all the things that we haven't actually talked about in this session, but maybe we'll talk about on another, that are going to allow you to get the full benefits out of migrating to cloud. If you do a pure lift and shift of the way you work today, then you're probably not going to get the best out of it.
Fantastic advice. Fantastic advice. Yeah, I think we could talk at length. We could have multiple sessions where we delve into all those very interesting topics in great detail, and hopefully maybe a few folk will pop along to our free surgeries on AWS to raise those very interesting topics. Michael, same question to you. Technical challenges that you might want to share, regale us with some tales from the trenches.
Yeah, sure. I think it's probably been covered quite a few times really with both Marcus and Dan. I think one of the most important things to really think about is the your internal teams really, and their understanding and the potential knowledge gap when migrating. So really think about that, learning how you're going to resource it in terms of training, whether it's going to be sort of in a self-service model, whether you're going to be working closely and alongside a partner such as you could sell at CloudSoft, and or going to public classes, etc., and working through those certifications, whether it's security focused, DevOps focused, data and analytics focused. You can specialize as much as generalize as well with the training. So it's not just a technology focus, it's also about the people within your organization. And that's something I always try and talk to customers about from the outset really, is what is the training plan and how are you going to resource that, because if your teams need to have that leadership around training and enablement.
Fantastic, thank you. And in the absence of any other cues coming in for the Q&A, I'll give you the last word, Aled. I'll let you give some sage advice, so to speak.
So in terms of technical challenges, like AWS gives you an excellent toolkit, lots of great services to choose from to build up your application, and but choosing the right tools, making them work together and using them in the right way for your use case is hard. Often the instructions and docs and blogs make things look deceptively simple. So the first warning is they might not match your use case. So the instructions that you're following might not actually work for you in your environment. And the second one is there's often a big gap between what the blog does and building a production-ready application. So things like logging, error handling, monitoring, and so on are so important and also so time-consuming to get right. So I think that's a big part of those technical challenges is estimating right, how do we do it, and how long is that going to take us? And moving iteratively is the way to kind of reduce that risk, constantly being breaking this down to small steps, testing things out in the AWS environment. You can do that during the migration and even more so afterwards. That mindset shift of being able to actually just stand up a new database or a new server, do your testing, and then tear it down again is so liberating for teams. And this is where if you're running on some old version of SQL Server, instead of having to go to your existing hosting provider and spend a fortune getting a new server to test out the new version, you just ask AWS to spin you up a new version. A few minutes later, you've got it. A few hours later, after you've done some testing, you tear it down and it costs you a few cents. It's an amazing difference.
Yes, very good. Thanks, Aled. Okay, last chance to pop in with any questions from the floor. Except, of course, it's not your last chance because we have these free virtual AWS surgeries. So let's not let the conversation end here. In the absence of any more right now, I'm sure you'll all think of great questions as soon as we end this session. So do feel free to drop us a line. But for right now, all it remains for me to do is to thank our 4 wonderful panel members and speakers. So, Michael, thanks for giving up an evening to come and support us on this event. And Dan and Marcus, thanks also for being so willing to share the battle stories and your expertise and tips for those who've attended. Aled, of course, always a pleasure hearing your insights into the cloud journey. And thanks to you to all of you for coming along, for giving up an hour and a half to come and listen to us chew the fat about cloud and AWS and Microsoft and migrations. So I hope you found it enjoyable and valuable, and I hope we get to hear from some of you at our next Pathway event. So watch this space. Thank you very much.
Cheers,
Thanks,
guys.
everyone.
Have a good
Bye.
evening.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Take care, folks.